Have you ever felt your heart pulled into directions, torn between duty and desire? Have you watched someone from afar, knowing that a single glance could change everything, yet unable to look away? Today, I want to share with you a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and the price of following your heart. This is the tale of a knight whose oath of honor became his greatest torment, and a queen whose gilded cage held secrets that could shatter a kingdom. Can love truly conquer all barriers, even those built by crowns and ancient traditions? Stay with me, because what you are about to hear will challenge everything you believe about sacrifice and the courage it takes to choose love over everything else. This is the story of Sir Alderon and Queen Isolde, and how a single vow changed the fate of an entire realm. In the cold stone halls of Castle Thornwick, where tapestries depicting ancient battles hung heavy against the walls, and the scent of burning torches mingled with the dampness of centuries, there lived a knight whose heart beat with the rhythm of duty. Sir Alderon was not born into nobility. His hands had known the roughness of poverty long before they gripped the hilt of a sword. He was the son of a blacksmith from the outer villages, a boy who had watched his father bend iron and steel with calloused hands, never imagining that one day he would bend knee before a king. But fate has a way of rewriting the stories we think are already written. Through countless battles, through blood spilled on foreign soil and scars earned in the name of honor, Alderon had climbed from nothing to become one of the most respected knights in the kingdom. His reputation was forged not through birthright, but through the sharp edge of his blade and the unwavering strength of his character. On the day he stood before King Edric in the Great Hall, surrounded by nobles draped in velvet and silk, he believed he was securing his future. He believed that swearing eternal loyalty to the crown would be the pinnacle of his achievements, the moment when all his struggles would finally mean something. He knelt on the cold marble floor, his armor reflecting the golden light of 100 candles, and spoke the ancient words that bound his soul to the service of the king. In that moment, as the heavy ceremonial sword touched each of his shoulders, Alderon felt pride swell within his chest. He had arrived. He had proven that a man could rise above his station through merit alone. But what he did not know, what he could never have imagined, was that this oath would become the chain that bound him to his greatest torment. For seated beside the king, draped in emerald green silk that made her dark hair shine like polished ebony, was Queen Isolde. And when their eyes met for the briefest of moments during the ceremony, something inside Alderon shifted, as if the very ground beneath him had begun to crack. Queen Isolde watched the ceremony with the practiced composure of someone who had learned to hide every emotion behind a mask of regal indifference. She had been married to King Edric for 3 years, 3 long years that felt like decades in a prison made of gold and jewels. Her life was a succession of empty rituals, formal banquets where she smiled at conversations that bored her, and lonely nights in chambers far from the king's own bedchamber. Edric had married her not for love but for alliance, a political arrangement between 2 powerful houses that needed to unite their forces against common enemies. She was beautiful, educated, graceful in every movement, and completely invisible to the man who wore the crown. She had accepted her fate with the resignation that all noble women learn from childhood. This was the price of being born into power. Personal happiness was a luxury, a childish dream to be abandoned along with dolls and fairy tales. But that did not make the emptiness inside her any less painful. At night, when the castle fell silent and only the distant sounds of guards changing posts could be heard, Isolde would stand at her window and look out at the stars, wondering if somewhere in the world there existed a love that was real, a connection that set souls on fire rather than leaving them cold as the stone walls that surrounded her. She had stopped believing in such things long ago, until the day she looked into the eyes of a knight who knelt before her husband, and felt something awaken inside her that she thought had died forever. The weeks following the oath ceremony passed in a blur of formal duties and calculated distances. Alderon threw himself into his responsibilities with even greater fervor, as if by serving the king with absolute dedication, he could somehow silence the voice inside his head that whispered the queen's name in quiet moments. He led patrols along the kingdom's borders, trained younger knights in the courtyard until his muscles ached, and volunteered for every dangerous mission that rose. Anything to keep his mind occupied, anything to avoid the truth that grew more undeniable with each passing day. He was falling in love with a woman he could never have, a woman whose very existence was forbidden to him by the sacred oath he had just sworn. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his entire life fighting for honor, and now honor itself had become his enemy. Meanwhile, Isolde found herself seeking glimpses of the night in the corridors and courtyards of the castle. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply curious about the man whose rise from peasant to knight had become the talk of the court. But her heart knew the truth. There was something in his eyes, a depth of feeling and integrity that she had never encountered in the shallow, ambitious men who populated her world. He looked at her not as a prize or a possession, but as if he saw the woman beneath the crown, the soul trapped inside the gilded cage. Their first real conversation happened by accident, or perhaps by the design of fate itself. Isolde had escaped the suffocating atmosphere of a state dinner to walk alone in the castle gardens, a rare moment of freedom she treasured above all others. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of roses and lavender, and the moon hung full and bright above the ancient walls. She had not expected to find anyone else there, least of all the knight who occupied so many of her forbidden thoughts. Alderon was standing by the fountain, his back to her, staring up at the same moon she had been admiring. When he heard her footsteps on the gravel path, he turned quickly, ready to bow and retreat, but she raised a hand to stop him. They stood there in silence for a long moment, two people trapped in circumstances neither had chosen, both acutely aware that this simple encounter was already dangerous. Finally, Isolde spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, asking him about the battles he had fought, the lands he had seen, the life he had lived before the castle. And Alderon, despite every instinct telling him to leave, to run before it was too late, found himself answering. He told her about the forge where he grew up, about learning to see beauty in molten metal and strength in disciplined repetition. He told her about his first battle, the terror and the exhilaration, and about the brothers in arms he had lost along the way. And she, in turn, began to share pieces of herself she had never revealed to anyone. She spoke about the weight of expectations, about feeling like a beautiful statue rather than a living woman, about the loneliness that no amount of luxury could ease. They talked until the moon had traveled halfway across the sky, and when they finally parted, both knew that something irreversible had begun. The secret meetings became a dangerous rhythm in their lives. They were careful, always careful, meeting only in the darkest hours when the castle slept and the guards were at their most distracted. Sometimes they would talk in whispered voices in the shadows of the library, surrounded by ancient books that held the wisdom of centuries. Other times they would meet in the abandoned tower on the eastern wall, where no one had reason to venture. They never touched, maintaining always the physical distance that propriety demanded, but their words created an intimacy more profound than any embrace. Alderon told her about his dreams, not just for glory, but for a life that meant something beyond warfare and bloodshed. He spoke about wanting to build rather than destroy, to create beauty and peace instead of just defending against chaos. And Isolde revealed to him the sharp, questioning mind that she had been forced to hide behind the demure facade expected of queens. She debated philosophy and politics with him, challenged his assumptions, and showed him that her intelligence was every bit as formidable as his skill with a sword. In those stolen hours, they were not knight and queen, not servant and sovereign. They were simply two souls who had found in each other the recognition they had been seeking their entire lives. But reality has a way of intruding on even the most carefully guarded secrets. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter, slipped under Alderon's door in the dead of night. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the words chillingly precise. Someone knew. Someone had seen them together, had noticed the glances that lasted a moment too long, had pieced together the pattern of their absences. The letter contained no explicit threats, no demands for payment or favors. It simply stated the facts and ended with a promise. Continued silence in exchange for future cooperation. Alderon burned the letter immediately, his hands shaking not with fear, but with rage. He had faced death 100 times on the battlefield without flinching, but this insidious threat against Isolde filled him with a terror he had never known. He realized in that moment just how deep his feelings had grown, how completely she had claimed his heart. He considered going to the king, confessing everything before the blackmailer could act, but he knew what the result would be. At best, he would be executed for betraying his oath. At worst, Isolde would be punished alongside him, perhaps even killed for the crime of making a powerful man look foolish. The laws of the kingdom were clear about adultery involving the queen. Even if that adultery existed only in emotion rather than action, the penalty was death, and not a merciful one. He had to protect her, even if it meant bearing this burden alone. But Isolde was not a woman to be protected without her knowledge or consent. When she noticed the change in Alderon, the new tension in his shoulders and the shadows under his eyes. She pressed him until he revealed the truth. They met in the abandoned tower, and as he showed her a second letter that had arrived, more threatening than the first, she made a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. She would not hide anymore. She would not allow this faceless enemy to control them through fear. Together, they would find out who was behind the blackmail and put a stop to it, whatever the cost. It was a dangerous plan, perhaps even a foolish one, but it was better than living in constant terror, waiting for the sword to fall. As they plodded in the flickering candlelight, their heads bent close together over makeshift maps and lists of suspects, neither noticed the shadow that passed by the tower window. Neither saw the figure that slipped away into the darkness, carrying news that would set in motion events far beyond their control. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than they could possibly imagine, for in the depths of the castle, in chambers where intrigue was woven as carefully as silk, there were those who saw in this forbidden love not a scandal to be stopped, but an opportunity to be exploited. Lady Muriel, the Queen's most trusted companion, sat in her private rooms and smiled as she listened to the whispered report from her spy. Everything was falling into place exactly as she had planned. Have you ever loved someone you knew you could never have? Have you felt your heart pull you toward a person while your mind screamed warnings about the consequences? I want you to pause for a moment and think about your own life, about the times when you had to choose between what you wanted and what was expected of you. Share in the comments below about a moment when love made you brave, when desire challenged duty in your own story. Your experiences matter, and I want to hear them, because stories like the one I am sharing with you are not just about knights and queens from long ago. They are about the eternal struggle we all face between the life we are supposed to live and the life our hearts demand. Now, let me continue with what happened next in the castle, because the web of intrigue was about to tighten around our lovers in ways that would test everything they thought they knew about loyalty, truth, and the price of forbidden passion. The true complexity of the situation began to reveal itself when Alderaan started investigating who might be behind the threatening letters. His inquiries led him to dusty archives in the castle's deepest chambers, where old records were kept by monks who spent their lives maintaining the kingdom's history. What he found there shook the very foundation of everything he believed about himself. Among brittle pages and fading ink, he discovered references to a scandal from decades past, a scandal involving his mother and a nobleman from the royal house itself. The implications were staggering, almost impossible to believe, according to these ancient chronicles. Carefully hidden away where few would ever think to look, Alderaan was not simply the son of a blacksmith. He was a bastard of royal blood, the illegitimate offspring of a brief affair between his mother and a prince who had died young, long before Alderaan was born. If the documents were authentic, and every instinct told him they were, then he was not just a knight serving the king. He was potential competition for the throne itself, an heir who had been hidden in plain sight, raised in poverty to keep him far from the dangerous games of succession. The revelation left him reeling. His entire identity, everything he had built his life upon, was based on a lie, or rather, on a truth that had been deliberately concealed to protect both him and the kingdom from the complications his existence represented. He knew he should keep this discovery to himself, that revealing it would only create chaos and danger. But he also knew he could not keep such a secret from Isolde, not when they had promised each other honesty in a world built on deception. When he told her, meeting once again in their secret tower sanctuary, she was silent for a long time. Then she did something that surprised him completely. She laughed, a sound somewhere between humor and despair. She explained that she too had been researching, following her own threads of investigation into the identity of their blackmailer, and in the process, she had uncovered information about plots within the court that made their personal situation seem almost trivial by comparison. King Edric, the man they both served, the sovereign whose authority they had sworn to honor, was planning something monstrous. Isolde had discovered documents, overheard conversations, pieced together a conspiracy that turned her blood cold. The king intended to use her younger sister, barely 16 years old, as a bargaining chip in a political marriage with a foreign prince known for his cruelty. Worse still, there were hints, terrible suggestions in private correspondence between the king and his closest advisors, that Edric himself was planning to eliminate Isolde, not through open execution, which would create a scandal, but through more subtle means. An arranged accident, perhaps, or poison slipped into wine during a routine dinner. The king had grown tired of a wife who had failed to produce an heir. and he needed to be free to make new alliances through marriage. The queen, once useful, had become an obstacle to be removed. The two revelations, taken together, painted a picture far more complex and dangerous than either had imagined. Alderaan, the loyal knight, was actually a hidden threat to the king's legitimacy. Isolde, the obedient queen, was marked for death by the very man who had sworn to protect her. And somewhere in the shadows of the court, someone else knew at least part of these secrets and was using them for their own purposes. The blackmail letters, they now realized, were not just about exposing a forbidden romance. They were part of a larger game, a chess match being played with human lives as pieces. Lady Muriel had positioned herself perfectly to exploit the situation. As the queen's closest companion, she had access to all of Isolde's secrets. As a beautiful and ambitious woman in a court full of powerful men, she had cultivated relationships that gave her information and influence far beyond her official station. She had been the one orchestrating the blackmail, using hired agents to deliver the letters and gather intelligence. But her goal was not simply to destroy Alderaan and Isolde. It was far more ambitious than that. She saw in the chaos an opportunity to position herself as the king's next wife, to rise from lady-in-waiting to queen herself. And to achieve that goal, she needed to carefully manage the timing and nature of the revelations she controlled. But Lady Muriel was not the only player in this deadly game. Unknown to everyone in the castle, there was a spy moving among them, a man whose true identity and purpose were hidden behind the humble robes of a traveling monk. Brother Thomas, as he called himself, had arrived at the castle months earlier, seeking shelter and offering to help in the chapel and archives. His presence had seemed unremarkable. Just another wandering religious man in an age when such figures were common. But Brother Thomas was, in fact, an agent of a rival kingdom, sent to gather intelligence and look for weaknesses that could be exploited. He had observed everything, heard whispers in confessionals and conversations in corridors, and had slowly assembled a picture of the scandals and secrets festering within the castle walls. The forbidden meetings between knight and queen had not escaped his notice, neither had the rumors of Alderaan's possible royal heritage, nor the king's plots against his own wife. All of this information he carefully encoded and sent back to his true masters in letters that appeared to be nothing more than theological correspondence with fellow monks. The rival kingdom was preparing for war, looking for the perfect moment to strike, and Brother Thomas was providing them with the intelligence they needed to time their attack for maximum devastation. The revelation of the queen's affair, or even just the suggestion of impropriety, would be the perfect pretext for invasion, a reason to claim they were coming to restore honor and proper order to a corrupt court. The pressure was building from all sides now, like a storm gathering strength before it breaks with devastating force. Alderaan found himself trapped in an impossible situation, pulled between conflicting duties and desires. His oath bound him to serve the king with absolute loyalty. But how could he serve a man who plotted murder against an innocent woman? His heritage, if revealed, would make him a contender for the throne itself. But such a revelation would plunge the kingdom into civil war. His love for Isolde grew stronger with each passing day, yet that very love put both of them in mortal danger. He began to understand that there would be no easy solution, no path that would allow him to honor all his commitments while protecting everyone he cared about. Choices would have to be made, terrible choices that would define the rest of his life and the fate of the kingdom itself. Isolde, meanwhile, was making plans of her own. She was no longer the passive, obedient queen who had accepted her fate without question. The discovery of the plots against her and her sister had awakened something fierce inside her, a determination to fight for survival and for the freedom she had been denied her entire life. She began to carefully cultivate allies within the court, identifying nobles and knights who were dissatisfied with King Edric's increasingly tyrannical rule. She gathered information, hoarded secrets, and prepared for a confrontation she knew was coming. And in her most private moments, in the deepest chambers of her heart, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she and Alderaan might somehow find a way to be together, to build a life free from the chains of duty and expectation that had bound them both for so long. The crisis point was approaching, and both of them could feel it like thunder rumbling on the horizon, promising a storm that would change everything forever. The tournament arrived like a blade concealed in silk, announced as a celebration of the kingdom's strength but understood by those who could read the subtle currents of court politics as something far more sinister. King Edric had ordered the grandest spectacle in a generation, inviting knights from across the realm and beyond to compete for glory and generous prizes. The official reason was to demonstrate the military might of the kingdom to potential enemies and allies alike. But Isolde knew better. She had overheard enough whispered conversations between the king and his advisors to understand the true purpose. The tournament was a stage, and on that stage, blood would be spilled in ways that could be made to look like accident or honorable combat. It was the perfect opportunity to eliminate threats without the messy complications of formal accusations and trials. And she was certain that Alderin, whether the king knew of his heritage or simply sensed him as a rival, for reasons he could not quite articulate, was marked as one of those threats. She tried to warn him, meeting in their tower sanctuary in the dark hours before dawn. She begged him to refuse to participate, to claim illness or injury, anything that would keep him out of the arena. But Alderin, bound by his oath and his sense of honor, could not bring himself to show cowardice before the entire court. To refuse would be to invite suspicion, to suggest he had something to hide or someone to fear. He assured her that he had faced death many times before and survived. He promised that he would be careful, that he would watch for treachery as closely as he watched for legitimate attacks. But even as he spoke the words, both of them felt the cold weight of premonition settling over them like a shroud. Something terrible was coming, and all their careful plans and secret preparations might not be enough to stop it. They held each other's gaze in the candlelight, neither willing to voice the fear that this might be the last time they spoke as free people, that the machinery of fate was already in motion and could not be stopped by mere desire or determination. The tournament began with all the pageantry and spectacle that such events demanded. Banners and brilliant colors snapped in the wind above the arena. Nobles sat in specially constructed boxes, shaded from the sun by silk canopies, and served wine and delicacies by an army of servants. Common people crowded into every available space, eager for the entertainment and drama that tournaments provided. The air smelled of horses and sweat, of roasted meat from vendor stalls, and the metallic tang of armor being polished to a shine. Heralds announced each bout with flourishing speeches, and musicians played stirring martial songs between matches. Alderin won his early contests easily, his skill with sword and lance far superior to most of his opponents. But with each victory, he felt the noose tightening around him. He could sense eyes watching him with more than casual interest, could feel the weight of attention that went beyond normal spectatorship. And then came the match that changed everything. His opponent was announced as Sir Gareth, a knight from a distant province whose reputation was solid but unremarkable. But when the armored figure entered the arena, something about his movement, the way he carried his weight and held his weapon, sent warning signals screaming through Aldrin's battle-trained instincts. This was no ordinary tournament challenger. This was someone who had come to kill. The bout began with traditional formality, both knights saluting the king's box before taking their positions. But from the first clash of steel, it was clear that this was no friendly competition. Sir Gareth fought with a viciousness that went far beyond what tournament rules permitted, striking at Aldrin's horse rather than engaging in honest combat, aiming for killing blows to unprotected areas that should have been off-limits by common agreement. Alderin found himself fighting not for victory but for survival, defending desperately against an opponent who cared nothing for honor or tradition. The crowd's cheers turned to gasps and then to shocked silence, as they realized they were witnessing something far darker than a sporting match. The turning point came when Gareth managed to dismount Alderin with a brutal strike that sent him crashing to the dirt. As Alderin struggled to rise, his opponent loomed over him, sword raised for a killing stroke that would have split his skull. In that frozen moment, time seemed to slow, and Alderin saw with perfect clarity the choice before him. He could die here, honorably, maintaining the fiction that this was legitimate combat, or he could do what every survival instinct screamed at him to do: fight dirty, fight to win. Damn the rules and the watching crowd. He chose survival. Rolling aside from the descending blade, he grabbed a handful of arena dirt and flung it into the eye slits of Gareth's helmet. As his opponent staggered back, temporarily blinded, Alderin surged to his feet and delivered a strike with all his strength, not to kill but to disarm and disable. His sword connected with Gareth's arm, and the force of the blow sent the other knight's weapon flying. Before guards could intervene, Alderin had his blade at his opponent's throat, and in a voice loud enough for all to hear, demanded that Gareth yield and reveal who had sent him to commit murder in the guise of sport. The arena erupted into chaos. Some spectators shouted approval at Aldrin's victory. Others called foul at his unorthodox tactics. King Edric rose from his seat, his face dark with fury that such a spectacle should occur at his tournament. But before order could be restored, before guards could seize Aldurin for his breach of protocol, something even more dramatic occurred. Gareth, face visible now that his helmet had been knocked askew in the final struggle, was recognized. Isolde, watching from the queen's box, felt her heart stop as she stared at features she knew as well as her own. The assassin was no distant knight named Gareth. It was Sir Roland, Aldurin's own sworn brother in arms, a man with whom he had fought in a dozen campaigns, someone he had trusted with his life on countless occasions. The betrayal was so profound, so unexpected, that for a moment Aldurin could only stare in disbelief. And then Roland began to speak, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent arena, confessing everything. He had been approached by agents of the court, offered gold and advancement in exchange for ensuring that the upstart knight Aldurin did not survive the tournament. He named names, pointed to nobles in the crowd who had been part of the conspiracy, and in doing so, tore away the veil of respectability that had hidden the rot at the heart of the kingdom. But even as Roland's confession echoed through the arena, even as guards moved to arrest those he had implicated, the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Lady Muriel, seeing her carefully laid plans collapsing, made a desperate decision. She stood in the royal box, her voice cutting through the confusion with the authority of someone who knew she was gambling everything on a single throw of the dice. She announced to the assembled crowd that the real scandal was not the assassination attempt on a knight, but the unholy relationship between that knight and the queen herself. She had proof. She claimed letters and testimony from servants, evidence of secret meetings and declarations of love that violated every sacred law of the realm. The accusation hung in the air like poison, and all eyes turned to the royal box where Isolde sat frozen, her face pale but her spine straight, refusing to show the terror that gripped her heart. King Edric's reaction was immediate and terrible. He ordered both Aldurin and Isolde seized, to be held in the dungeons pending investigation and trial. Guards swarmed into the arena and toward the royal box. But before they could reach their targets, another voice rang out, and this one carried an authority that even the king could not immediately dismiss. Brother Thomas, the humble monk who had been such a quiet presence in the castle for months, threw aside his robes to reveal the armor and insignia of a foreign prince. He declared himself Prince Marcus of the Northern Realm, in exile from his own kingdom and seeking allies in his quest to reclaim his throne. He offered his protection to both Aldurin and Isolde, promising military support and safe passage out of King Edric's reach. The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. What had begun as a tournament had become a political crisis of unprecedented proportions. Multiple conspiracies, hidden identities, and conflicting loyalties all collided in a single catastrophic moment. The kingdom teetered on the edge of civil war. In the chaos that followed, as factions began to form and armed men took sides based on loyalty or calculation, an even more devastating truth emerged. A court physician, seeing the way events were unfolding and fearing for his own safety if he continued to keep silent, came forward with information that changed everything. Queen Isolde was with child. He had examined her in secret weeks earlier when she had come to him with concerns about her health. The child could not possibly be the king's, as Edric had not visited his wife's chambers in over a year, a fact well known to the servants who attended both monarchs. The implication was inescapable, and the announcement sent the crowd into a frenzy. According to the ancient laws of the kingdom, a queen who bore a child not of royal blood was to be executed immediately, and the child with her. There would be no trial, no opportunity for defense. The law was absolute. Aldurin, still in the arena and now surrounded by guards with drawn weapons, felt something break inside him. All his life he had tried to do the right thing, to follow the rules and honor his oaths, to be the kind of man who served justice and protected the innocent. But the system he had believed in, the order he had sworn to uphold, was revealing itself as nothing more than a tool of oppression, wielded by those powerful enough to bend it to their will. In that moment, covered in dirt and blood, facing the woman he loved being condemned to death for the crime of caring for him, Aldurin made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He rejected his oath to the king. He rejected the authority of a crown worn by a tyrant, and he called upon every person in that arena who valued true justice over corrupt law, to stand with him against tyranny. It was treason, pure and simple, spoken aloud before thousands of witnesses. But it was also liberation, the shedding of chains that had bound him since the moment he had knelt before a king. unworthy of his service. The response was not what anyone expected. Knights and common soldiers, nobles and servants, people from every level of society began to move, to choose sides in a conflict that was no longer theoretical, but immediate and deadly. Some remained loyal to King Edric, whether out of genuine conviction or fear of the consequences of rebellion. But others, more than anyone would have predicted, moved to stand with Alduin and the Queen. They were tired of a king who treated people as pawns, who murdered inconvenient wives and crushed anyone who threatened his power. They were ready for change, even if that change meant war. Prince Marcus and his small contingent of foreign warriors joined the growing force of rebels, bringing with them both military expertise and the promise of external support. The tournament grounds became a battlefield, and the kingdom's fate hung in the balance. King Edric, seeing his authority challenged so directly, made a fatal error born of rage and wounded pride. He drew his own sword, something kings rarely did, and charged toward Alduin with the clear intention of killing him personally. What happened next would be debated and discussed for generations. Isolde, who had been held by guards in the royal box, broke free with a strength born of desperation. She ran down the steps and threw herself between the charging king and the knight she loved, willing to die if it meant saving him. The king's blade was already in motion, too committed to the strike to be easily stopped, and in that frozen moment, as steel descended toward the woman who wore his crown, the crowd saw with absolute clarity the kind of man Edric truly was, a king who would murder his own wife in public, driven by jealousy and rage, was not fit to rule anyone. The blow never landed. A dozen hands reached out to stop it, guards and nobles who had been loyal to the crown, but could not stomach witnessing regicide performed by the king himself. In the struggle that followed, Edric was disarmed and restrained, his authority crumbling away like sand in a storm. The nobles, always quick to sense which way power was flowing, began to proclaim their support for a new order. Some called for Alduin to take the throne based on his newly revealed royal heritage. Others demanded a council of regents to rule until proper succession could be determined. But in the chaos and shouting, one thing became clear beyond any doubt. King Edric's reign was over. The trial that followed was swift and brutal in its honesty. Edric was formally charged with conspiracy to murder, abuse of royal authority, and attempted regicide against his own wife. The evidence was overwhelming, gathered from servants and advisors who had been waiting for the safety of confession that only the king's fall could provide. He was found guilty by a council of his own nobles. The ultimate irony for a man who had trusted no one and inspired loyalty in none. His sentence was exile rather than execution, more out of fear of the precedent of killing an anointed king than any mercy for the man himself. He was stripped of his crown and title, given 3 days to leave the kingdom, and forbidden on pain of death from ever returning. Lady Muriel, whose manipulations had helped precipitate the crisis, was similarly exiled. Her dreams of queenship turned to ashes. Sir Roland and the other conspirators in the assassination attempt faced harsher punishment, their betrayal of knightly oaths considered more heinous than political maneuvering. But even in victory, there was no triumph for Alduin and Isolde. The child growing in Isolde's womb became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, a living reminder of broken oaths and violated traditions. Despite Alduin's revealed heritage, despite the support they had gained, there were too many in the kingdom who could not accept a queen who had been unfaithful, even to a monster, and a bastard knight who had betrayed his oath, even to a tyrant. The compromise reached by the council was pragmatic but painful. Alduin would not take the throne. Instead, a distant cousin of the royal line, a young man with an untainted reputation, would be crowned as the new king. Alduin and Isolde would be granted their lives and their freedom, but they would have to leave the kingdom. They could never return to the castle, never reclaim positions of power or authority. They would live the rest of their days in exile, together but forever separated from the world that had shaped them. Before they left, as dawn broke over a kingdom transformed by violence and revelation, Edric appeared one final time, surrounded by guards who ensured he could do no harm. He spoke a curse that chilled everyone who heard it. He swore that the child Isolde carried would never know peace, that the bloodline begun in sin and betrayal would be forever marked by tragedy, that kingdoms would fall, and families would be destroyed before the debt of their transgression was paid. Whether the curse had any real power or was simply the impotent rage of a defeated tyrant, no one could say, but the words hung in the air like dark prophecy as the former king was led away to begin his exile. Aldurin and Isolde left the castle with nothing but each other and the clothes on their backs. They traveled north, far from the center of the kingdom, to a small village nestled in forested hills where no one knew their faces or their history. They took new names, presented themselves as minor nobles fallen on hard times, and began to build a life from the ruins of everything they had lost. Aldurin found work using the skills he had learned in his youth, before swords and battles had defined him. He worked with wood and metal, creating tools and small works of beauty that the villagers needed and appreciated. Isolde, freed from the suffocating protocols of court life, discovered talents she had never been allowed to develop. She became a healer and teacher, using her education to help those who had never had access to such knowledge. And when their child was born, a son with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, they named him Edric, a gesture of forgiveness toward the man who had cursed them and the kingdom they had left behind. The years passed quietly, marked by seasons rather than political intrigue, by the simple joys of family rather than the dangerous games of power. They grew older together, their love deepening as it was tested not by dramatic crisis but by the daily challenges of ordinary life. They never forgot who they had been or what they had lost, but they learned to cherish what they had gained: freedom to choose their own path, the ability to love openly without fear or secrecy, a life measured in authenticity rather than obligation. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when their son slept and the stars shone bright above their modest home, they would talk about the past. They would remember the castle and the court, the moments of terror and the choices that had defined their fate. And they would acknowledge the truth that both had come to understand. They could have had power. With Aldurin's heritage and the support they had earned, they could have fought for the throne and possibly won. They could have ruled the kingdom together, reshaping it according to their vision of justice and compassion. But such a victory would have required them to become the very thing they had rebelled against, to compromise their principles in service of ambition, to sacrifice their humanity on the altar of authority. The choice they made, to walk away from power and embrace exile, was the harder path in many ways. It meant accepting that they would never be celebrated as heroes or remembered in history books. It meant raising their son in obscurity, knowing that his royal blood would bring him nothing but danger if it were ever revealed. It meant living with the knowledge that the kingdom they had left behind would continue to struggle with the same problems of corruption and inequality, and they would not be there to try to fix it. But it also meant that they had kept their souls intact. They had chosen love over duty, authenticity over image, life over legacy. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest victory possible for two people who had been born into a world that demanded they sacrifice themselves for abstractions like honor and obligation. Their story became legend in time, though the details were distorted and romanticized by bards and storytellers. In the tales, they were tragic heroes destroyed by forbidden love. In reality, they were survivors who had found a way to build happiness from the ashes of everything they had lost. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, if you have felt your heart race with the dangers faced and sighed with relief at the choices made, then I want to invite you to join this community permanently. Subscribe to this channel for weekly stories of love that defies convention, of courage that challenges authority, of people who choose authenticity over safety. These are not just stories from the past. They are reminders that in every age, in every circumstance, we face the same fundamental choice between living the life others expect and living the truth of our own hearts. Hit that subscribe button, because every week I bring you stories that will make you think, feel, and question everything you thought you knew about love, duty, and the price of freedom. And remember, the most powerful act of rebellion is not violence or dramatic gesture. It is simply the choice to love honestly, to live authentically, and to refuse to let fear write the story of your life. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next story.